course, all this business of the addicted army is a lie. There is no truth to it that drugs sap the military's will to fight. There was no truth to the lie that drug use is rampant in Vietnam. Marijuana use by the military in Vietnam was about the same level of use back by the American civilian population at home, which, no doubt, actually was fairly high at around 28% by 1971. And there are charts to show that it was the same in Vietnam as the same as it was back home in America. It was mostly confined to the rear lines at that. When soldiers used it in combat, they sometimes ended up being decorated for bravery or praised as superior soldiers by their commanders. For example, commanding officer Colonel Douglas Lindsay is quoted in the book saying, quote, "Many pot smokers are amongst the most intelligent members of the regiment, and soldiers who smoke pot are more likely to be found among the better soldiers in the unit." And this is a report he gave back to Com Central in Vietnam as to the use of drugs in the military that he was observing. But however, booze was a different trip. Private David Tuck of the 25th Infantry Division describes the military awards of actually hacking off the ears of, quote, goots. Quote, "The person who had the most ears was considered the number one Viet Cong killer, and when we get back to base camp, they would give us all the free beer and whiskey they could drink." According to Kuzmarov, 88% of soldiers drank alcohol during their time in Vietnam, often in prodigious amounts, and prodigious is in quotes there from the book. Binge drinking accounted for 73% of junior enlisted men and 63% of senior enlisted men. American doctors in Vietnam said alcohol problems were far worse than any imagined drug problem. Many soldiers feared going into action with people who had been drinking because they would often be, quote, incapacitated and put everyone's life at risk. Helicopters were used to keep these troops constantly supplied with booze, says one helicopter pilot in the field. Support for the addicted army myth achieved its most ardent backing from General Barry McCaffrey, who commanded the troops in Vietnam and later became the drug czar under Bill Clinton. Kuzmarov notes that McCaffrey claimed the army he, quote, loved was, quote, almost destroyed by illegal drugs in the 1970s. This, McCaffrey explained, had a terrible effect, quote, on the discipline of our soldiers, on the rape, violence, and spiritual loss of focus in our physical health, end quote. In other words, we didn't butcher women and children, says the Tsar. We didn't rape anybody. We didn't burn villages to the ground. We didn't waterboard people. We didn't napalm the skin off of children. We didn't drop more bombs in Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II. We didn't shoot families for fun. We didn't toss people out of helicopters. We didn't jump on cattle and try and stab them with knives as we rode them to kill their animals for no particular reason. That wasn't us. That was marijuana. When Caffrey became drug czar, he promised to defeat, quote, the drug cancer, as Kuzmarov put it, to mitigate the pernicious legacy of Vietnam. McCaffrey, the drug czar, adopted the mantra of McCaffrey the general, which he repeated to his troops in Vietnam like a prayer: go out and kill for God and country. By the way, that's the general's exact words to soldiers in Vietnam, and indeed today Canadian soldiers hear the same credo from their officers in Afghanistan, always reminding them that killing the enemy is fun, killing the enemy is the way to do battle, and it should be enjoyed and embraced. It's been the basis of American drug policy ever since, a policy that comes to Canada with the jailing, for example, of myself. No extradition to the U.S. for imprisonment. That campaign is very much an extension of the reaction we have to do in order to deal with this post-Vietnam syndrome. It's educational to look at Germany for comparison. The Germans, for example, were able to admit their responsibility and guilt for their horror, the Holocaust. They saw it as wrong. And to this day, they present it that way to the generations that have followed. They didn't say they lost the Holocaust because of a drug-addicted military, although the Germans were often very drug abusive in World War II. And understanding I am going to the United States jail is to understand Richard Nixon and his legacy of America. And that's why these things I find this book fascinating. Nixon used the Vietnam War to start the modern drug war. The United States had two choices: either jail people like me, or lose the doctrine of manifest destiny. If the United States can't be the world's narc, Nixon warned, then it's out of the global and domestic domination business. It is therefore failing in its sacred duty as the chosen people. For example, I was a major force in getting possibly up to 50% of the American public to believe that marijuana should be legalized. My campaign, the $4.5 million I spent from 1994 to 2005, had a tremendous effect in Canada of getting 24% of the public to 52% of the public favoring the legalization of marijuana, and similarly so in the United States. That means one half of America does not believe it is their manifest duty to pursue the moral inquisition that is the modern drug war, a war that was justified by a lie about Vietnam. And, of course, if I am not stopped, as former DEA head Karen Tandy said in her press release on the day of my arrest, If my successful propagandist activities continue, well, that won't be allowed to continue if America is to be dominant. It would, as Nixon understood all too well, destroy the lie he used to prop up the whole show. We would lose, reasoned Nixon at the time, our ability to manipulate our population in the world. This is why Nixon once told a committee that he created to study marijuana, at the outset, he said, I would never legalize marijuana, no matter what truths were revealed, according to Nixon. Indeed, Nixon's Schaefer Commission did in fact conclude that marijuana ought to be legalized, and Nixon burned his own personal copy in disgust. This is why the Harper government can refuse to allow me to serve my time in Canada. Drug crimes, say the Harper Crusaders, are now a matter of national security, much as Vietnam was a matter of national security. And no kidding, the weed prisoners in the United States are being refused entry back into Canada because they're being called threats to national security. Nixon, Kuzmarov revealed, had more respect for communist totalitarian societies with their gulags than he had for any democratic society with people smoking a joint, say, at Woodstock. This explains why the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. It also explains why none of us will recognize Canada in a few years. Nixon railed to Haldeman, quote, do you think the Russians allow dope? No, it is the enemy of strong societies. When you look at the history of civilizations, those who turn on to drugs lose their spirit. They go down. They are destroyed. The question is, will it happen to America? End quote. You know, like Nixon, Stephen Harper believes that no price is too high if civilization is to be saved from a plan to stop people from killing enough gooks to achieve salvation. With Bill C-15 and all the other bills that the Conservatives have proposed, Canada will soon have the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world, in perhaps as few as 5 years. The Vietnam War was often referred to as the helicopter war. And during the marijuana harvest season in Canada this year, for example, we saw detailed media reports of police in various Canadian provinces using the search and destroy methods made famous in Vietnam and taught to our helicopter pilots here in the RCMP and the Canadian military by Americans. Canadian police, adhering to Nixon's transformation of the Vietnam War to the drug war, have simply substituted marijuana for gooks. And police now regularly fly over rural regions of Canada in helicopters, just as American combat soldiers flew over the country of Vietnam in helicopters. And both the combat soldiers and the police look on the ground below as an enemy haven. The enemy could be everywhere. Everyone is suspect. Police inside the helicopters are dressed in full combat gear. They are heavily armed with automatic weapons. They are wearing war paint. This is a war after all, and they must be prepared to, quote, kill for God and country, end quote. The helicopter lands and the police rush out, guns at the ready, war paint gleaming, all to search for marijuana. And when they find it, reinforcements are called to destroy it. Farmers cautiously watch the invasion from their homes, men running around with guns in the middle of their fields. They told reporters of seeing a convoy of vehicles coming down the road and going to where the marijuana was found. 2 minivans, 2 large Suburbans, all with darkened windows, and a flatbed trailer with 2 ATVs to finally get at those marijuana plants. And yes, what did they find in Nova Scotia? About 40 marijuana plants that were eventually destroyed. We leave the last word, or I'm going to leave the last word, to Kuzmarov as he ends this truly remarkable book, and I encourage everyone to get it. He writes of, quote, nearly 350,000 souls currently imprisoned in what McCaffrey, of all people, once termed America's drug gulag. The author concludes that the Vietnam War has come back to haunt us in yet another way. And this time, he really means all of us. It really means Canadians, Americans, Mexicans, Colombians, Bolivians, because we are all gooks now.
For more information on Marc Emery, go to cannabisculture.com.
Marc Emery may go down south. He's got a brain and he uses his mouth. A little loud, so he got caught. The whole world knows he's the Prince of Pot. He's the Prince of Pot. He's the Prince of Pot.